Hi, I'm Ting Williams, and I did an article on Is Anybody in There by Dr. Adrian M. Owen. Meet Brian Buchanan. He was an 18-year-old, simple dude in high school. He was with a fellow church of his, and then him and 60 other teenagers went on a camping trip to Sunset State Beach. That's in Santa Cruz. Him and his friend actually was digging a 6-foot hole under a sand chaperone, and unlucky for him, the whole thing collapsed. Now, what had happened was because so much sand has collapsed on him, it took, well, first of all, 15 minutes to dig him out, so at that point he was oxygen deprived, and because of all the sand landing on him, this is what happened. He had to go into intense trauma care, and it's because of the amount of trauma care that we do have today, is he was able to make it out alive. But the bad thing is, he had lost all control over his body, so actually no one knows if he's alive. At this point, all he's able to do, he's on sleep and wake cycles, so he can wake up and he can sleep, but no one knows if it's just natural reflexes of the body or if he's actually awake. So that is what it's called vegetative state. Now, as a result, researchers are wanting to know if he's actually awake, if he's conscious, if he's able to comprehend information. So he was actually thrown into a PET scanner, which is a positron emission tomography scanner, to see if there's any kind of cognitive functions in the brain. And when he was put in, you can see that in the vegetative state there is some functions. So like you can see that there are neurons still going in between, so he's not totally dead. As you can see, brain death is just completely black. At that point, you're completely dead. There's no chance of revival. And of course, you can see that a normal brain would have all its normal functions. Now, I want to quickly discuss like the different types of disorders of consciousness, and I say vegetative state because there's actually worse. Brain death. Brain death is just where all functions of the brain just cease to exist. From the stem cell, everything in the brain ceases to exist, and that is when you're normally called as dead. And in a coma is when typically you would go into sleep and you would have no consciousness at all until probably 3 or 4 weeks afterwards. Now, vegetative state is the one I think I will be focusing on today. That is where the sleep cycles will occur. You may wake up, you will wake up, but minimal, if any, consciousness you will have. Minimal conscious state is when it's similar to vegetative. However, you do show signs of awareness and you can reach for an object and you can have some kind of motor control. And then the last one, the Lockness syndrome, it's not necessarily a disorder, but it is also considered to be some kind of a vegetative state. The only difference is that the patients can blink their eyes. So at that point, if they start blinking, you're able to tell that they have some kind of consciousness. And moving on, this is Dr. Owen. Dr. Owen is the one that wrote this article. The first thing he decided to do was when he saw the brain picture of a vegetative state patient, Ryan, he tried to find out a certain way in which he can promote the brain to show us that it's thinking. So like, say like, you want to talk to the patient and say like, hey, think of this while, to say yes to this question, to initiate the brain to show some kind of signals that yes, it is awake, it is conscious, and it is thinking. So initially, he had thought to go through certain speech recognitions, say like unspeech noises to see if he will respond to any kind of noises. But going through the research, he thought that noises are unreliable because actually our brain will regulate noises even if we're not thinking about it. You know what I'm saying? Like our brain will keep using like noises as a recognition, but it will never use it so that we fully know exactly what's going on. It's a natural response of the brain, so it's not fully reliable. Now the real question was, like, how could we promote the brain to show that it's alive? How could we promote it so that it'll show functions that is so just pinpointed to where it is conscious, right? Now, the one method that they thought was to make the brain work. Use hardcore activities so that you're using certain parts of the brain. Now, I want to focus on two methods that they used. They used playing tennis and they used walking from room to room. Now, what's interesting about these two methods, while you're thinking of it in your brain, when you're wanting to play tennis and you're thinking about playing tennis, you're using only the premortal cortex of your brain. That's the only part of your brain you're using when you're thinking about playing tennis. However, when you're thinking about going from room to room inside your own house, you're using the parahippocampal gyrus and the parietal lobe. So those are very specific areas in which you will use when, playing tennis and walking from room to room. Now, what was interesting was the first person that Dr. Owen had tested this on. He had used the analogy of, look, you can hear me if you say yes by playing tennis on a court. Just think about, if you want to say yes, play tennis on a court. If you want to say no, think about going from room to room. Now, after he was kind of like told an instruction, they sent the patient into a functional MRI, which a functional MRI just shows like the brain waves and brain activity, and this is what came up, which seemed very promising. As you can see over here up top, this is the yes, this is the no, tennis, and spatial navigation, that is walking from room to room. Up top is the control. That is a completely healthy patient that was just told, if you want to say yes, think about playing tennis. If you want to say no, think about going from room to room inside your house. And this was the result of the brain activity. Now, it's also looking at the patient that is in a vegetative state. At this point, they don't know if it's conscious. And since speech recognition is unreliable, they're using it anyway. So they're telling the patient what to do at this point. But the patient cannot physically respond, so it has to respond via mentally. Now, as you can see, the patient still displays signs that it is conscious. Like, you can compare the two, and even over here you can see that the patient has had some trauma in the brain. However, it is able to still think like a healthy volunteer, thus deeming it vegetative and having consciousness. Now, why does this matter? For many things, like it gives us an understanding of exactly the consciousness and the awakeness of a person, despite their physical state, and then also it provides them a different environment, knowing that they're conscious rather than dead. So, like, you would act differently towards a patient if you know that their mind is still working and they can hear your every single word, rather than if they're just laying there completely just utterly dead posed. It's a different environment. People will react to them differently. They will have their normal humor. They will give them a normal environment as if they were alive, because their brain is alive. And also, this opens new doors in which to communicate with patients by thought alone. Like, that itself is pretty cool. Like, if you can just communicate with the person just by reading their brain signals, in which it's super cool. That was just a food for thought. In principle, it is already possible to directly ask a patient if he or she wants to continue living in his or her current situation using the fMRI technique. However, would a yes or no response be enough to signify that the patient has retained the cognitive and emotional capacity to make such an important decision? Food for thought. Any questions?
What do you think?
I personally don't think so, because we are still, the two questions used are so specific in different parts of the brain. And to make such an important decision as if to live alone, that incorporates many, many parts of the brain contributing information. I don't believe so, but it's the fact that they can say yes or no is so pretty cool.
But I think there's a part in the brain where you use cognitive and like cognition and logic. I think
It's the front.
prefrontal
Yeah,
cortex or something like that.
it's something like that. It's not. It's somewhere in the front.
So maybe like if through an MRI you see activity there when you ask such a question. Maybe it shows, hey, they're thinking something.
Or you could tell them, like, if you want to say yes, think about tennis or something.
Yeah. What was also interesting because in order to get some kind of activity in the brain, they need to stimulate. So what happened with Brian, before they sent him into the PET scanner, they had actually showed him pictures of family. Of family and pictures of just loved ones. That is what kind of stimulated everything. So like as a result, they like kind of like saw that there was brain activity. So like they can stimulate via pictures. And that.
You mentioned that with coma and everything, that's like rarely they wake up 4 to 5 weeks.
Coma.
Yeah, coma. So how do you explain like with people that don't wake up till like a year later?
That would be extensive.
Okay.
I don't know. I can answer that one. There are ways. There are patients out there that I was searching on that haven't waken up for 16 years in a vegetative state. Like in a vegetative state, they do have some kind of consciousness, but when they're asleep, they're asleep, but they haven't waken up for 16 years. That is a super long time to stay in a vegetative state. So in a coma, it is possible to stay in a year. However, I don't know how much like how brain dead you'd be.
So that was pretty much the average then for people.
That'd be average.
So the result that you showed us today, so that is the result from only one particular patient, right?
That was the result of the first patient.
Yeah, first, okay.
Dr. Owen ended up trying to repeat this process. For many of the patients, of course, he did not know if they're in a vegetative, minimal, conscious, or locked-in syndrome state. He didn't know. So he tried this process over many, many patients, 2 different times, 16 patients, and 3 of them responded with this exact technique. So 16% in which they exactly as the first one, it responded the same exact way. So that is pretty good. Not knowing that if they're alive, if they're conscious, but it does work.
So which means even though they are in vegetarian states, they were able to listen the doctor saying.
Yeah. Because the human mind does keep regulating sound, does recognize sound and voice. And at that point, they don't know if it's conscious, so they're just talking to him anyway. Because there is no loss in just trying to talk to the patient. And if they do understand, they will respond. And the response means that they understood and then their mind is awake.
So what do you think, from this article, do you think any things that we apply for biomedical engineering field?
Well, just understanding just the brain in general. We could always understand the brain more.
How about the bioimaging?
Bioimaging.
Yeah, maybe we can
bioimaging. Like the fMRI, like to be able to use bioimaging in such a way, I think opens a new door for bioimaging, which I think is really cool. And also using like bioimaging to communicate with patients via thought process, it's pretty cool too. What do you guys think?
I think maybe there could, like, if this like became like something that people started pursuing, it could be like just working on imaging systems that are like specifically designed for this type of test.
Mhm.
Like working on the way that the MRI works and making it like specialized for a test like this.
Thank you, Ting.